Anika Benail, and I am a planner here at SCAG, focused on equity and performance measurement and monitoring. I'll be facilitating today's session along with another planner here at SCAG, Amy, who is also focused on equity and performance measurement and monitoring. Jennifer Martinez is joining us today to help with any and all AV related needs. And as I said before, if you haven't already, we'd love for you to type your name, your organization, and your pronouns into this chat feature. Next slide, please. So on this next slide before you, you'll see a couple of housekeeping items. This workshop is anticipated to run for about an hour and a half. And right now, all participant lines should be muted already. If you have a question at any time during the workshop, please feel free to type it into the chat box. We definitely encourage you to ask questions at any time, just to make the best use of this workshop and for you to walk away with the most out of it. And at the end of this workshop, we'll have a dedicated time for Q&A. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can during that time. But if we're not able to get to all the questions, we'll definitely make sure we can work with you and find opportunities to answer these questions. If you think of anything later, feel free to reach out to myself directly. I'll be sharing my contact information following today's workshop. And then also a recording of this slide deck and this presentation and some additional resources will also be available via the SCAG's website following today's workshop. And we'll also send a link to those that have registered after the event. Next slide, please. So today we'll be starting off by providing a brief background on SCAG's recent equity efforts. And then we'll dive into why you might be interested in evaluating your racial equity baseline conditions. We'll then introduce the process for developing your own community baseline conditions. And then we'll shift into discussing this next steps and opportunities before breaking out into a quick 10-minute breakout session to discuss what you've learned. Finally, we'll share a potential opportunity for upcoming sustainable community programs, call for, and then wrap up with some time for questions. Next slide, please. So today you will walk away from this workshop learning more about how to measure and compile data on existing inequities and disparities in your community, as well as monitor and evaluate equity outcomes, use data to mitigate or reverse key equity gaps, limit access to resources, and finally, leverage existing resources to develop your own community's racial equity baseline conditions report. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Amy.
Yes, hi everyone, and I apologize in advance if my very chaotic cat makes an appearance today. And thank you so much, Anika, for turning it over. Before we go a little bit further on the presentation, just want to provide a land acknowledgement. So this here is a map from Native Land, which is a great resource in learning more about the lands that we are currently occupying. As staff at SCAG, we acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Chumash, the Tongva, and the Kizh peoples. Today, we will be speaking much about equity, inequities, and disparities between different communities of people. And so much of that begins with concepts of land and property, whether with the establishment of race through the history of slavery and through the violent displacement of the original indigenous peoples, so their land could be taken for resource extraction. As we acknowledge that we are on the original lands of the Chumash, the Tongva, and the Kizh peoples, and how deeply the field of urban planning continues to engage with the concepts of land, we offer this acknowledgement as a first step to more conversations and actions that will support Indigenous communities in thriving. Next slide. So with that underway, we just wanted to pop up a poll and we want to know who was in the room. So Jennifer, I believe that you should be able to start a poll. We have one on the screen just asking, who are you from? What are your communities and who are you representing? And we have community, city, county, regional, state, or federal levels. Seeing a lot of people from city level. think I'll just give it another few seconds, but great to see everybody responding. I'll give you 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And so it looks like the majority of people who are here are from the community or from the city or the county level, which I think just really emphasizes the local nature of who is here today. And I think can help us guide how we're going to be talking through involving equity and thinking through baseline conditions in your jurisdiction. So next slide. Thank you, Jennifer.
Great. Now that we got a better sense of who's in the room, to start things off, I'd like to share a quick update on SCAG's equity efforts, our region's existing conditions, and how we can all support the development of a more equitable, inclusive region. Next slide, please. So as some of you may be aware, last September, we kicked off work with a special committee on equity and social justice in response to the Regional Council's resolution that affirmed its commitment to meaningfully advance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. The committee focused on further developing SCAG's response to advancing equity throughout the agency's activities, as well as advising SCAG's Regional Council on policies and practices to enhance its resolved intentions. We've made significant progress over the course of the past year, culminating in the approval of SCAG's Racial Equity Early Action Plan last month. And this plan will really ensure that this work can endure for years to come. Next slide, please. So our early action plan is grounded in this definition. Thank you. Grounded in this definition with a focus on leading with racial equity so that we can address the pervasive and deep inequities disproportionately experienced by people of color across our region. Essential to SCAG's work, racial equity describes the actions, policies, and practices that eliminate bias and barriers that have historically and systematically marginalized communities of color to ensure all people can be healthy, prosperous, and participate fully in civic life. Next slide, please. So our early action plan is also grounded in understanding of our regional conditions. We have taken stock of our existing conditions through past plans and more recently by completing a preliminary assessment of our baseline conditions, analyzing the racial inequities experienced in our region today. And we hope to refine and expand this analysis in the years to come, as well as use it going forward to help measure our region's progress over time. Next slide, please. So from this work, we uncovered more about the inequities and disparities across race and ethnicity. For example, you can see on the right here, just one of the indicators that we examined throughout this process, housing burden. This analyzed, across different racial and ethnic groups, who was the most burdened by the cost of housing across our region. As you can see, Hispanic Latino renters and Hispanic Latino homeowners were burdened by housing by far the greatest of any racial or ethnic group in the region. So this is a brief glimpse of what our work was developing a racial equity baseline conditions report and our current status. But now I'm going to turn it over to Amy again to share a little bit more about why you might consider developing your own baseline for your community. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Nika. Just going to wait for the next slide. But now that you have learned what SCAG's work has been and what the baseline conditions are, we really want you to think through how it might work for you in your jurisdiction or your organization. Next slide. So we have yet another Zoom poll, but we really want to know, the last one. So many people, so many organizations are at such different places in their equity process. And we wanted to ask you, what actions have you already taken to advance equity in your jurisdiction, in your organization? I think Jennifer is going to activate the next poll. And this is not meant to be an anxiety provoking exercise. Like you're like, oh my goodness, there are all these different actions that I haven't yet taken or don't really know a lot about. And that's what, we're doing here today, is just really trying to figure it out and see if we can be a support and resource to you. So give it a few more seconds. I'll give it maybe 5 more seconds. And all right, I'm polling. And I think you can really see, just as I mentioned, is people are still trying to figure it out. And that's great. That's why you're here today. And that's why we're here today as well, which is to help support you and trying to figure out your next steps. So next slide, please. As Anika outlined in a previous slide, it is incredibly important to do baseline conditions. A range of economic and social impacts, such as health outcomes and education and employment, vary vastly in the region based on race, income, and census tract. Conducting the baseline conditions really helps you understand what might be the barriers for your community members in being able to thrive. And because it helps you understand what these barriers are, it helps you track changes in these barriers in a way that is data-driven. And because you can track the changes, it helps you better understand the impacts of race on outcomes. And this allows you to overall, and most importantly, support those better outcomes for your entire community. Next slide. As a very brief case study, I just wanted to provide an example of the City of Oakland's equity indicators. So for their equity indicators report, they developed a baseline quantitative framework that could be used by staff and community to better understand the impacts of race and to measure inequities. It enabled data-driven decisions about programs and policies to address these inequities and ensure people have equitable access to opportunities and services administered. And they can also monitor progress, setbacks, and potential areas of improvement. Next slide. No, so we saw in the previous poll, a lot of folks are here still trying to figure it out, and that's okay. This might be a bit of an unfamiliar topic for you, and it's definitely okay if you feel uncertain or not really sure what your next steps might be. Presumably, you're at this toolbox because you might be interested in learning more about what a baseline conditions is, or you might want to do one. And so these questions are intended to help assess your readiness, and they include questions of why? What is the motivation for you in your jurisdiction or organization to want to measure inequities and disparities in your community? What kind of stakeholders or data do you already have access to or relationships with? What might be potential challenges or roadblocks? And what is your timeline, and how do you hope to embed opportunities for feedback and engagement? Next slide. So to help guide this development and understanding of the baseline conditions, we really wanted to present a proposed process. And we'll be going into this in more detail shortly and throughout the entire presentation. So the timeline here breaks down what the creation process should look like. And so centering community, which is that orange bar over the top, is a perpetual step that should be taking place over the entire course of the baseline conditions development. Step 1 is establishing a vision which guides the objectives behind your baseline conditions. Step 2 is defining the indicators. 3 is analyzing the data relating to those indicators, and 4 is sharing the story that you've now created over the past few steps. This timeline is also useful for emphasizing another core value, and that is communicating with urgency and with gravity. And so this is not to say we were talking about speaking the entire, talking about rushing the whole process so that it takes place within 2 months or some other arbitrary timeline. It's really about acting and moving through the entire process intentionally and with the intention of moving it forward and emphasizing the importance of movement on racial and social justice. Next slide. And so with that, I wanted to start with this first perpetual step, which is centering community, and arguably the most important step of this entire process. So what does that actually look like? Next slide. I wanted to provide another case study of a jurisdiction that did their equity indicators and their baseline conditions, and that's the St. Louis region. The inequities within these areas were researched both through the analyses of existing data and the exploration of additional resources, and a draft framework was eventually created. After this, feedback was solicited from a wide range of stakeholders, which included community members and advocacy groups, and indicators were vetted and data was identified. Community workshops were then conducted in order to further explore the barriers to overcoming the inequities identified and how to move forward. And at the end, 8 indicators for 3 separate topics were chosen. And so I wanted to present this specific example because of how they asked questions about, first, the methods in which they were reaching out to stakeholders, and secondly, who they were reaching out to, which are 2 of the most critical questions. They investigated various stakeholders and talked to various stakeholders and used community workshops as a way to engage these stakeholders. Next slide. The first question of who you're reaching out to is really important. And so in the next slide, in the following slide, I wanted to present a few guiding questions in thinking through who you're going to be engaging with. And so you want to consider who has historically been left out of these important planning questions and conversations, and how will you bring them into the conversation? How can you partner with and build on existing assets and resources in different communities? And so this might be, or this might look like elders or existing community leaders in the community. What existing relationships or partners do you already have? Excuse me. Similar to the question on community assets and resources, who are communities that you have already developed relationships with? This is particularly important because of how it leads into the last and the next question, which is how can this process be used to foster even deeper relationships to the community impacted by these inequities? And how can it be used to build even more trust or rebuild it when it has not been historically great? Next slide. One useful tool for thinking about who you're going to be reaching out to is this tool from the State Governor's Office of Research and Planning, which calls on these factors to be considered to ensure equitable outreach. So as you're considering perhaps different groups of people or communities to reach out to, you might be considering the different intersecting lenses of people who might fall into these different categories. You may be mulling over how to partner with, for example, specific ethnic communities like Khmer speaking, Cambodian community or a Black community, but you might also want to consider who you should be reaching out to as a part of these individual communities and groups of people. You should ask questions like the literacy level of those that have been missed from building these relationships within the past, or dynamics of socioeconomic status and class and differences in local history. This can be used to guide how you think about who you reach out to. Next slide. And the second question that I brought up, which was prompted by the St. Louis example, was how this community engagement would occur. And so the St. Louis example described the community workshops, and it might be something that works for your community. So consider whether there are opportunities to expand engagement or when it might occur over the course of the year. Like, for example, you don't want for it to fall over the holidays, or maybe summer might look a little bit different when you have considerations for kids who might be out and parents might have to take care of kids. And so importantly, what does this engagement look like? So there are such a wide variety of engagement opportunities, and I think different levels of what these can look like. And they can include having these roundtable discussions or conversations, having a booth at a popular community fair, or going to schools or churches or other trusted community centers. And so I would even suggest dropping in the chat right now some suggestions that you might have for other methods of engagement or outreach, or things that you've seen in other places that you've really appreciated. Next slide. And so when thinking through how this engagement should take place, a useful tool to use and think about is the IAP2 spectrum of public participation, which can help guide how you think about the framing of these engagements and being intentional in both developing a specific public participation goal and the promise of the public. And so I would suggest, while building out your baseline conditions, you want to be really involving, collaborating, and empowering to ensure that the feedback from your stakeholders is meaningful and intentional, and their words are being valued and heard. Next slide. Now, spoken through community engagement, and this is like this is the first step. Community engagement should be occurring throughout the process. And now this one is about actually developing what the baseline conditions could look like. And so next slide, please. We're going to take a little bit of time. So I want to ask people to really intentionally enter this space right now. Put your feet on the ground, take a deep breath, close your eyes. I think most people have their videos off, so you can turn your videos off and lie on the ground even if you wanted to. And I want to ask and invite everyone to be silent for a minute and imagine what it is that your community could look like if everybody was thriving. So we are going to just sit for a moment and just imagine what this could look like. I want to ask while this is taking place, if you could click again, Jennifer. I want to invite you as well while you're sitting with this and thinking through how it could look, even how it might taste, and how you might imagine not just how it looks like, but the senses that are going through your body as you imagine what everybody would look like if they were thriving. So you can draw it, you can write it, you can, even if you want to mute yourself, talk it out to the next person sitting beside you. Grab anything that's on your desk and just think through it in a way that works best for you. Okay, and I'm going to slowly invite you to return. Hope that you're all breathing and not just holding your breath as I kind of was for the past minute. And now with what you've seen and thought about and imagined, we want to emphasize and just want to say that this is what the vision for your community could be. And this is the initial step for what it could look like. And we invite you to hold this image in your head as we continue throughout this process, as a lot of the indicators and the data work and everything else that you're going to see in this presentation will really be oriented around this initial vision. Next slide. So if we envision this work that you're going to be doing toward racial and social justice and equity as a tree, as outlined on the slide, this vision that you're now holding is a really core important part of the tree. This vision of your community thriving is like the actual tree itself, beyond the roots and the important necessary components that the tree needs to thrive. Next slide. It might be useful to look at how other jurisdictions have thought through these visions or desired results similar to, or desired results that they might call something else other than their visions. So as a local example, we can look to Long Beach, and theirs, for example, is that race and ethnicity alone do not determine social and economic outcomes for those who live and work in Long Beach. And you can also look at resources like the Government and Alliance for Racial Equity, for Race and Equity. And you can look back at the vision that you've written down and see if there's any way that you can tweak or think through any differences or any changes that you might want to make to that vision. Next slide. Going back to this metaphor of what I was using for this tree, this vision is really important because of how it is what the public ultimately sees, but it is guided by the roots to buffer the vision and allow it to grow. So can you click again, Jennifer? So this includes these important components like the baseline conditions, like a report. and a potential roadmap or action plan for racial equity that might encapsulate the baseline conditions, programs, and potential other funding. And importantly, it covers the baseline conditions, which, if you click again, Jennifer, which we will definitely go through in more detail over the course of today's workshop. Next slide.
Thank you for taking us through the centering of community and also developing your vision. I feel like every time I spend the moment just thinking about what my vision might be for our region, it takes me a little bit further in that thought process in developing that vision. So let's now ask ourselves, what should we measure to establish that vision? Next slide, please. So now we're going to jump into just another poll about where you might be able to obtain that data to develop your racial equity baseline conditions. So a poll should jump up on your screen. Great, and we have a variety of options there, including federal, state, local, community surveys, academic resources, and policy organizations. So I'll just give you a moment to fill that out. We'll give it just another 20 or 30 seconds. Looks like so far we have a lot of responses for community surveys, as well as for federal sources, but all are pretty high up there. Okay, so why don't we close that poll? Take a look at the results. So as you can all see, it looks like community surveys was pulling ahead with also federal sources high up there. Depending on what kind of data you're looking for, all of these could be potential sources of data for developing your baseline conditions report. Next slide, please. So let's first start off just by defining what exactly is an indicator. An equity indicator is a community level measure that captures the results we observe across populations over time. This could include things like the rate of poverty, the rate of unemployment, or rates like of chronic diseases or pollution burden. In the cases of indicators of racial equity, these are specifically disaggregated by race and ethnicity. And overall, the indicators are not quick to move because they're meant to reflect kind of the generations of policy and systems failures that have produced racial inequity over time. However, they serve as a powerful measure to hold your efforts accountable and really measure that change over time in these measures. In addition, these measures might look similar across the country to other jurisdictions, but as you start to disaggregate that data and really interpret the results, you'll see that it tells a unique story about your community. Next slide, please. So in step one, we developed our vision for what an equitable future might look like. Now we must think about what measures might actually capture that vision. Your indicators will really depend on what your community prioritizes. So for example, as you can see on the screen, if your vision is for racial equity across in housing, meaning that there's no racial disproportionalities in homeownership and access to safe and affordable housing, you might have homeownership or housing burden or overcrowding as indicators that you focus on. If you're looking at employment or living wages or transportation, you might have a different handful of indicators that you're focusing on. Next slide, please. So in SCAG's recent baseline conditions analysis, we considered 26 equity indicators, including those related to economic vitality, housing, mobility, and environment. And these really aligned with the Connect SoCal goals. Each indicator provides a regional snapshot disaggregated by race and ethnicity, county, and other demographics whenever possible. So following today's presentation, we'll be sharing a document with a long list of indicators that have been compiled from other existing sources that you can consider as you develop this for your own community. Sources include the National Equity Atlas, Bay Area Equity Atlas, Healthy Places Index, File Buyer Screen, the City of Oakland, and more. Next slide, please. So once you've kind of identified these indicators that you'd be interested in measuring, you should also decide, how are you going to get this data? Is it a trusted and accessible data source, such as a federal or state agency? How exactly is it disaggregated by race and ethnicity and other factors? Does the indicator actually align with your goals and policies? And also, with what regularity can this data be produced? Indicators are meant to serve as a record over time and also really capture those trends over time. This requires a really rigorous and regular data collection design. And a really great example of this is the American Community Survey of how we have that data over time that we can look at and also disaggregate by race, ethnicity, and also look at things like income or linguistic isolation or other indicators. Next slide, please. So because the scope and the scale of this collection, population level data often comes from federal, state, county, and our other local and regional agencies, along with maybe university partners or other nonprofit institutions. One really important thing that you want to consider as you move forward with what indicators that you select, depending on the indicator and what data source you're looking at, this data is going to be available at varying levels. So some are going to be at the county level, some are might be up at the city, the census tract level, block group, etc. And so some may be more useful to than others, depending on the size of your jurisdiction and what the community really voices is most important to them. Also, very important to note that oftentimes these are much bigger scale, and sometimes the community wants more fine-grained neighborhood level data that might not necessarily be in one of these large scale sources. And so that's when it's really important to work with the community to bring that data also to the front and to make sure that data is being prioritized and analyzed, whatever type of data it might be. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest concerns that we also faced with data here at SCAG was really regarding language. So larger census groupings really conceal inequalities across categories. And depending on the variety of factors such as ethnic origin, experience, migration status, or the length of time that maybe individuals and their families have lived in the US, you might see differences across race and ethnicity, or they might be concealed. For example, though Asians overall rank as the highest earning racial and ethnic group in the United States, this isn't a status shared by all Asians. In the category, Asian is further stratified, Chinese, Korean, Thai, etc. Certain Asian communities really experience a disproportionate burden of poverty. In California, nearly 1 in 4 Asians are working full-time, but still struggling with poverty. It's really important then to take that and break it down and disaggregate and really figure out what is the data telling us or what is it concealing. So at the regional level here at SCAG, we currently use the population groups listed on the right here. SCAG intentionally lowercases the word white in the category white, but does capitalize the category, the population group Black, which is in line with guidance both from what has been voiced by Community Voices and the Associated Press. We highly recommend looking to the Associated Press style book for additional guidance on language. Next slide, please. Great. So I just walked us through our step 2 of defining indicators. And now we're going to go into step 3, analyzing the data. So in this step, we're going to be looking at the data trend for each of the indicators that we've selected, disaggregated by race and ethnicity, and then also whatever relevant demographic breakdowns specifically matter to you in the community in your jurisdiction. You're then going to ask yourself, what exactly is the data telling us? And also take that a step further and to step 4, what would happen if we did nothing different? I do see also just a comment in the chat. I can address it right now, and the recording will be sent following this presentation as well. Next slide, please. So at the highest level, we have two major types of data that exist: the quantitative and qualitative data. Qualitative data is observed and gives us really information about the qualities of things, and it's much more categorical. So it might include things like names or colors or maybe applicable examples here like gender or national origin. Methods to collect qualitative data could include things like focus groups or interviews or surveys and other methods. On the other hand, quantitative data, as on the right here, can really be measured and statistically analyzed. So this data is measured in terms of numbers. Quantitative data includes things like income or age or other numbers, numerical values. Methods that you might use to consider analyzing this type of data could include Excel or ArcGIS or maybe a higher level of analysis like SPSS, SAS, or R. One thing to note is that our local jurisdictions can take advantage of complementary RDP GIS licenses, have access to Esri software, and also utilize the Living Atlas to access American Community Survey and other types of data. And so we'll drop a link to how you can request a license for your jurisdiction if your jurisdiction hasn't already requested one. So today, we'll be focusing on quantitative data analysis, but that's not to say that qualitative data is not important. And it's actually quite critical to actually capturing the full story of inequity in your community. Consider, what types of qualitative data could be used along with quantitative data. Might this be stories or art or quotes or interviews to complement, what we find with maybe surveys or census data. Next slide, please. So today we're going to actually briefly walk you through about how you can analyze access to broadband across race and ethnicity. Specifically, we're going to look at Pasadena, but this is an example of what we did here at SCAG's level, what we found in our regional analysis. This shows that we see 14% of residents didn't have access to broadband, while across the region, and specifically 19% of Hispanic Latino residents had the highest rates of lack of access to broadband. Jump to the next slide. So like I said, today we are going to demonstrate how to utilize IPUMS to extract data based on race and ethnicity for a specific location. We definitely recognize that this scale might not work for every jurisdiction, but we really hope that you can walk away with a basic understanding of the extraction process and where you might be able to begin. Following today's presentation, also, if you need any additional resources, please click on the links here for IPUMS, which is what we'll be using today. And then we also have a wealth of other resources for data.census.gov, Social Explorer, and some other potential data sources that you might be able to utilize for your analysis of indicators. And those will be shared following this presentation. We have the link here to the IPUMS website, which will also be dropped in the chat. And Now we're going to go through a quick tutorial. It will prompt you if you have never used this site before or open it up to log in. So you can quickly make a username and password just to be able to follow along, or you can do so after today's presentation as well. We can go to the next slide.
So today we are going to do a tutorial of how to use IPUMS USA to do a basic analysis of broadband access by race and ethnicity for a specific geographic location. We're going to start off here on the IPUMS USA website, and we're going to navigate down to the online tool for analysis. If you have access to statistical software at your jurisdiction, you can also create your own custom data set and download that and use your software to analyze that as well. We're going to click on Analyze Data Online. We're then going to select our sample. So by going to the bottom of this page, we are going to select the most recent 5-year American Community Survey data sample. This is the 2015 to 2019 5-year ACS sample. After we click on that, it'll pop up this screen here. And we are going to now select, what variables we actually want to be analyzing. In this case, we're looking at broadband access, race and ethnicity, and geographic scale. In this case, we'll be looking at Pasadena, so we'll be looking at the city scale. We'll start off here by adding something to our row column. Here, we're going to start off by going to the household over here on the left-hand side. And this is going to be an expandable list that provides a list of all these different variables of what you might be able to examine in IPUMS. If you're confused on what any of these mean, you can also go to the code book up here on the top left. And that'll give you a little bit more, finer grained detail of what this variable means and what you can do with it. I'll also show you how to view the variable, which will give you, again, a little bit more detail about what that variable means and what categories might be within it. So we're going to start off by going to the household, and then we're going to navigate down to the appliances, mechanical, and other tab. Click on that. Then we're going to select broadband access. This is, if you go a little bit down, you'll see this one here, broadband access. And we are going to view that variable just to better understand what's inside of it. So we'll go up here to the top. You're going to see it just shows you a little bit of a breakdown of what's within this variable. You have yes, no, not applicable, meaning, they have access to broadband, they don't, or not applicable as if they didn't respond. X on out of that. And then we're going to add this to the row. So we're going to ensure the append button is clicked over here on the left. And then we're going to click row, copy to row. And it shows up there. Next, we're going to look at the column, and we're going to look at race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity are asked separately on the American Community Survey, and thus they are two different variables within IPUMS. So we have to figure out, how do we want to navigate that to look at Hispanic or Latino or not Hispanic or Latino single race variables. So we'll go on over here, and I'll just show you a little glimpse of what those variables look like, and then a workaround. So if we click on race and ethnicity and activity, and then race, we're going to view the variable again. And you'll see that these are the categories that pop up. This is not quite the categorization of what we're looking for today. And we really want to group some of these categories together and maybe rename them as well. We X on out of that. We can next look at that Hispanic origin variable and see what's within that variable. You go over here to the left and click Hispan, and then view. you'll see again that we have maybe a little bit more detail than what we're looking for today. We're really interested in looking at non-Hispanic or Latino and Hispanic or Latino. So we are going to X out of that. And then we have to figure out, what are we going to do to combine these two variables? There are many different ways that you can go about this. And IPUMS USA actually provides a great tutorial about how you can create a three-way table and recode some of those variables. I am going to show you today a little bit of a workaround and something that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise been able to find. And that's if we go up here, the top left, and go to create variables. Then we're going to go to list created variables. After you click this, it'll pop up a list of created variables that have been hosted within the public workspace, and variables that you're able to use and that others have joined or merged these different categories and also simplified it for us. So we're going to look at the race ethnic variable, which if you scroll on down, you'll see this one here. And we're going to view the variable just to see what's in it. When you open that up, it shows you what was this computation that somebody did to create the variable, and then what categories they produced as a result. So in this case, we're going to use these categories today, but you might be interested again in doing a different type of analysis or different categorizations, and you can definitely do that within recoding your own variables or produce a three-way table pretty easily. I'm going to X on out of this, and I'm going to click select. After I click select, I'm going to navigate back up to the analysis tab up here on the top left. And after I clicked analysis, we'll see that this variable carried on over with us. The next step here is that we want to add it to the column row or column box. So we're going to make sure append is clicked, and then we're going to click on column. And it pops on up. Our next step here is that we want to filter our results to focus on a specific geographic region. In this case, we're going to be focusing on Pasadena, just as an example. But again, you can look at a variety of different geographic scales depending on what your jurisdiction is most interested in or what level of analysis you want to be doing. So we're going to be adding something to this box for selection filter. We're going to go up to household, geographic, and again, expand that little column, that little row. And we'll see down here is city. Click on city. We'll do the same thing as before and view the variable. Next, we see a list of cities in this pop-up box. And we're going to go on down to Pasadena. You'll see Pasadena is right here. And I'm actually going to use this number to the left, 5150. So I'm going to copy that. We're going to add that number to our filter by filtering all these results to the number of the city. So X out. And then we're going to add column, or we're going to add city to the filter box. And you'll see that filter now has this variable city, as well as two brackets for you to input what city you might be interested in focusing on. As I just mentioned, I'm going to be inputting the number of the city. So I'm going to add 5150. And that will allow us to filter our results. From here, we have a variety of different options that you can select within our output options, chart options, decimal options. And you can even create and download your own CSV file. I'm going to just use the basic options for today, but feel free to explore those and see what else you can produce or customize within your output. One thing that you really want to make sure is just making sure that you have the right weight selected. In this case, we're going to be focusing on race and ethnicity. which is an individual variable, one that's specific to the individual. So we want the person weight. So once we have all this, we're going to run that table and press run the table. And it will produce a new tab that has our output. You can see up here on the left that it has the same variables that we just selected. And you'll see in this table that we have broadband access over here on the left for our rows. And then we'll see race and ethnicity is up here at the top for our columns. When you get into the details of this data, you can see what is this data saying. We see that nearly 11% of Hispanic Latinx residents identified as not having access to broadband. And another nearly 20% did not respond to this question. You'll also see that we see 82.3% of white residents, 83.7% of Asian or Pacific Islanders, and 84.4% of two or more races did identify as actually, yes, they do have broadband access to broadband. It's interesting then when you look at this data, there is a lot of not respondents, and not for all variables it's like that, but it's something important to consider is, where do we see the disparities and inequities, and why might they be that way, and how can we really interpret that results and take it a step further? Now that we have the numbers, that show discrepancies of who might or who might not. But then how do we find the root of that? How do we incorporate the community into interpreting this data? Which is, what do residents say that might be the cause of this? And then as we move into step 4, we'll really want to be thinking about, how can we take action to address these disparities and inequities? So this was one example of how you can use a tutorial to use IPUMS USA to examine some data. But there are a lot of other ways, again, that you can do this. We hope that this is just one way that you have as an example. So today we are going to
Great. Thank you so much. You can keep it right there on the guiding principles. So that was just a brief introduction to using IPUMS, and just that's one method of ways that you can analyze data. And it really provides you a simple way of looking at race and ethnicity for a specific indicator. But throughout this data analysis and interpretation process, it's really critical that you bring in and leverage a racial equity perspective. It's important to examine, your own background and biases. What are you bringing to this table that might bias the interpretation of the data? In addition, make a commitment to dig deeper with the data, disaggregate it further, analyze the intersectionalities or trends over time. Also ask, why are there so many non-respondents of a certain community? Who might be missed within our census collections or other questions like that. Also, really be sure to recognize the often oppressive history of the research process, and really take steps to move forward past that and ensure that your research is benefiting the communities that you're either not analyzing, but you're examining what those inequities and disparities might be for specific communities. Make sure after you get that data, utilize it. Make sure it goes back and benefits the community. And then also throughout this process, continuously center community by intentionally engaging them in this work. Have maybe your jurisdiction, work alongside with CPOs, community-based organizations, and other residents to interpret those results and better understand why the data is the way that it is. And also, finally, guard against this implied and explicit assumption that white is the default position. By bringing these guiding principles into your work, it really helps provide a more holistic interpretation and analysis of the data that you might be examining. Next slide, please. As you move into step 4, it's really important to consider that racial equity is a long-term goal. And for many, it might feel like a very overwhelming vision to achieve. However, what we have seen is that when there are topics that we feel urgent about and we prioritize action for, significant changes can take place quite quickly. Making sure to communicate your equity narrative with urgency will really be critical to maintaining motivation and inspiration to work collectively towards racial equity objectives. Next slide, please. So as we communicate our findings, you can share this narrative through a variety of mediums, including a report similar to SCAG, spatial analysis with mapping such as the Healthy Places Index, a dashboard, a story map, fact sheets, and more. The National Equity Atlas is a really great place to find a lot of these resources and to really review other examples of how other jurisdictions have communicated and disseminated their findings. They also recently launched the Racial Equity Data Lab, which has developed fantastic tutorials for how you can visualize your data. It really dives into showing how you can use Tableau to visualize that data and develop then your own fact sheets. This is a fantastic resource. I definitely highly encourage you to check out those video recordings of those Tableau tutorials by the National Equity Atlas. Next slide, please. And the work doesn't stop there. It's more than talk. You definitely need to act too. So use these findings to shift the needle of equity in your community. Here provides a model of how you can shape your equity narrative and look for action using the 3 steps of affirm, counter, and transform. We don't have enough time today to go into the details here, but we highly recommend the Government Alliance on Race and Equity and their resources, and we'll be linking to a plethora of those as well for you to explore. The other component about the action is think about, when will this actually be updated? Will this be annual, every 2 years, every 3 years? And then also who will be responsible for this work moving forward and who needs to be involved? This is not a holistic picture, or this is not a complete picture, and making sure to bring in community along every step of the way is critical to making sure you act effectively and with urgency. Next step, please, or next slide, please. And I'll just briefly introduce something that SCAG did recently was develop a racial equity early action plan, which sets out 29 actions and a framework of goals and strategies, as you can see here, that guides our future work and will ensure that this work can endure. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Nika. So we've gone through a long, intensive presentation today that could be I think needs a little bit of time to process, and thankfully we'll have breakout rooms, I think shortly, that will lead us through and give you the opportunity to talk through all the things that you've learned today. But just wanted to outline a few potential steps for you in your organization or jurisdiction. And you see on the slide here, you can continue to build relationships with CBOs and residents. You can join peers at GARE, which Anika just mentioned, the Government Alliance for Race and Equity. You can develop a plan for moving forward on what you've discovered, and you can apply for funding to address existing inequities. And we'll have a little later today a presentation from another SCAG colleague who will be presenting on our next call for a Sustainable Communities program. And that will be coming shortly. Next slide. So now we wanted to take a bit of time to let you just process and think through all the things that you've just seen in the past hour. And so we have an opportunity for breakout rooms right now. And so Jennifer, I think you're going to break out into 3 rooms with myself, Annalie, and Anika. And we're just going to talk through these questions and just see and we can even leave these questions, just see what folks have to say or what you're thinking after going through this process. So it's going to wait a moment for the breakout rooms to come. And I think we're going to have around 10 minutes to chat. The questions I'm going to also drop in the chat, and Jennifer as well will be sharing them momentarily when we all get into the breakout rooms. Great. See you all soon. Welcome back. I think we're still waiting for a few people, unless, or it may not be. Well, welcome back. I hope you all had great conversations in the breakout rooms. It seems like, I know our group, we definitely had some thoughts and people were really processing some of the things that they heard about in the past hour. And so if there are any observations or any sort of conclusions that you came to or any sort of insights, would love to hear them. You can just drop them in the chat. But in the meantime, I would like to invite, next slide, if you could, Jennifer. I would like to invite my colleague Anita to speak a little bit more about the call for applications for the next call of the Sustainable Communities Program. So you can take it away, Anita.
Thank you, Amy. And welcome everyone. I'm going to be providing a brief background on SCAG Sustainable Communities Program, specifically our call for applications number 4 for the 2020 and 2021 cycle year. So next slide, please. So SCAG Sustainable Communities Program started in 2005, and the program aims to provide resources and direct technical assistance to local jurisdictions. We've already completed 3 calls for applications in the 2020 and 2021 cycle on smart cities and mobility innovations, housing and sustainable development, and active transportation and safety. So SCAG will release the 4th and final call for applications for programs and projects centered on civic engagement, equity, and environmental justice later this fall. Next slide, please. So the Sustainable Communities Program aims to accomplish these 7 goals listed in the slide here, with each call focusing on one area. So this upcoming call 4 will focus on the goal of promoting, addressing, and ensuring health and equity in regional land use and transportation planning, and closing the gap of racial inequity and better serving our communities of color. So that would be the orange one. The second one, promote, address, and ensure equity. Next slide, please. So specifically, this 4th call for applications, we want to center and prioritize racial and social equity. We want to address pervasive and deep inequities experienced in historically disinvested communities and communities of color. We also want to include a wide range of eligible activities to address the inequities. We want to support programs and projects that actually help close the gap of racial inequity. And lastly, support SCAG's existing equity efforts in our racial early action plan, Connect SoCal, as well as public participation plan. So the objectives for this 4th call includes focusing support especially in SCAG's communities of concern and SB 535 disadvantaged communities. We want to support local planning efforts that help eliminate barriers to civic engagement. We definitely want to make sure that we're building and sustaining community capacity as well as trust. And most importantly, we want these projects implemented in the prioritized communities. Next slide, please. So as part of the calls for application, we include a list of eligible project types in 2 areas. The first is civic engagement. Next slide. And the second is equity and environmental justice. In the interest of time, I won't go through every single one of these project types because we do have a list of examples for every single one of them. So that would actually take a few minutes. But we will go through each and every one of these during our listening sessions in July, which I will discuss in the next few slides. So next slide, please. So for the timeline, we're still developing the call for application structure, and we will continue to gather input from stakeholders in our July listening sessions. And then we are going to draft the guidelines in August and release the call for applications in September, with the project recommendation and awards taking place in spring of 2022. This again is subject to change, but this is what we have currently. Next slide. So we definitely welcome you to join us at one of our listening sessions scheduled for Tuesday, July 13th from 11:30 to 1 p.m., which is during the lunchtime, and Thursday, July 15th from 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m., which is the evening time. Hopefully those 2 times are more convenient for you. Both sessions will provide the same information, so you only need to attend one. If you're interested, please RSVP. And also we, in the RSVP link, we provide a space for you to provide any questions you may have beforehand, so then we can address them accordingly during the listening session. The slide will also be shared with all participants, so the link is readily available for you if once you download the PowerPoint, or I think it's also going to be provided in the chat. If you have any questions regarding this 4th call for applications, please don't hesitate to contact me. My name is Anita Au. My email and phone number are provided in this slide. And with that, I can complete my presentation and move forward with the next item.
Thank you, Anita. We are so close to the end right now, and we just wanted to ask one last Zoom poll. Hopefully it's been a good resource and a good use of an hour for everyone here. But we wanted to ask, how else can SCAG be useful for you? What other types of resources would be helpful for you? So we're just going to activate this one last poll. And would love to hear from you in terms of additional resources or Toolbox Tuesday trainings that could be helpful for you. Great. And I will end polling. So it looks like people are asking for more information and resources on equity tools and outreach or engagement, which I think are really, will be good for us to know. And I think can be something that SCAG works towards and providing more resources on. So with that, next slide, please. I wanted to thank you all for participating in today's Toolbox Tuesday. As we mentioned at the outset, presentations, recordings, additional resources will all be emailed to all the registered participants And later this month, we will also be posting recordings from all the sessions on the Go Human website. We'd also encourage you to consider participating in our upcoming equity working group, which is this Thursday, June 24th at 10 a.m. And you can sign up for that on the SCAG website. And I think someone might be dropping a link in the chat. And if you have any additional resources, any additional questions or follow-up questions, please feel free to contact us as shown here. And also feel free to drop these questions in the chat as well. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you stay safe and healthy. And Carolyn, you're asking about the chat included in the recording. Are you asking specifically about the links that we put in there? I think that's yes. So we'll have links to all the things. We'll have copies of the links that we mentioned throughout the presentation in the resources that we'll be sending out with the presentation. All the links posted, yes. Yeah. And if anyone has any questions, we'll be here for another 2 or 3 minutes.
I'll ask a quick question that I feel like is definitely one important to think about. You know, what were some challenges that that we faced here at SCAG during this process, and you know, what might other local jurisdictions potentially face as they think out, you know, their baseline conditions?
I feel like timeline. Oh, go ahead, Annalie.
Yeah, it's been handed over to you since you wrote it.
I would say, I think a big one was like timeline, is everything was so constrained because I think rightfully is like one of the things that was spoken about a little earlier in the presentation was the tension between wanting to maintain that movement, especially a lot of the momentum that came out of, I think, the racial justice uprisings last summer, and seeing action come out of that, but then also balancing that with the shortened timeline, all the implications and the difficulties that that can entail.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Looks like we may have had most people jump off, I think, at the end of the presentation, which makes sense. I think I only see a few still on. Nikki, do you have any questions? If not, we can probably call it a day and wrap it up.
That sounds great. That sounds great. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you. And Natalie.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.